on. I gotta fix my camera. I gotta fix my camera. There we go.
Hey, Dax.
Waiting for Jay. Not in the WeWork today?
Yeah, I think he should get WeWork. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Awesome. Let's switch over to my sexy voice. Okay. All right. Yeah, I have to turn Twitter notification off.
Let me look at the
yesterday
tweet.
it was
Wow, nice. 36 retweets.
yeah. I was wondering if if the influencers they have a different notification setting for their apps.
Yeah, I think they do, and I wonder how it works because they must get like millions if it. Yeah. I did remember there was a company I was working at, and they were looking for an acquisition, and we were talking to Instagram at one point, and they were telling us that they're kind of selling us on the team that we would join, and they were describing how maybe like a year before they had this issue where whenever someone famous did a post, like their systems would like catch on fire because like it would just get way overloaded. So they're like one person like Beyonce could just like ruin their like day because they had to then like run in and and fix everything.
Wait, who's this? What happened?
This was like years ago, and I was talking to like some people that worked at Instagram. That was like shortly after, not shortly after, but like they were acquired and they're trying to figure out how to make everything like integrate everything into Facebook infrastructure. So there was like a moment where it wasn't really at that scale, and they had to like run into the office and do a bunch of stuff whenever someone famous was going to do something.
Yeah, I remember, when we were working on Catmus, it's like Twitter. Back then, Twitter was all your friends' tweets are like sorted chronologically, and we were building this service where we could figure out, what was important, and then we showed that at the top. That was who was it that were using it? And we were like eating at like a very sketchy restaurant, and then and all of a sudden my phone would start beeping. It's like database queries is behind. The API response rate is spiking. Yeah, who was it? Yeah, it was some actress, right? That was trying.
Yeah, I think she was, and this was like 2008, 2009. She was big on Twitter. Alyssa Milano.
Oh.
For some odd reason, because back then, like Twitter was mostly for like tech people, but for some reason she was big on it. I don't know why, but
Nice.
All right.
Yeah, so maybe to set this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I'm not sure if like the thing I shared with like different solutions, if that makes sense. I think I was just reading it. Some of the options felt a little bit weird. Where like if we move, everything to the code, then how do we decide which resource goes to which stack? Of course, we probably won't be able to fit everything inside one stack. if we define the least, just create an API in Stack and start adding routes in the code, like where do we keep that mapping? There's some like details to be figured out, but I felt it was I had something to think about when I was like writing some of the solutions out. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe let's
Yeah.
set it up. Like, what are we trying to talk about? What's sort of the issue? And maybe it's mostly me, but before we sort of dive in.
Yeah. Dax, what did you feel? But yesterday after we got off the phone, we went to like have lunch, and then we were talking, and then I didn't feel like that big of a deal, like what Jay was saying back then, where he felt, Jay, maybe you can restate what your issue is with
Yeah, maybe let's start there. I think there are a bunch of different things, but the bigger piece I think is actually related to, in some ways, what Dax was saying the other day, where like it feels like some of these handlers, like I think there needs to be sort of a coherent design behind them, and as I'm sort of looking at it, like the auth one, obviously, like from a functionality perspective, totally makes sense. But we're introducing a few different concepts, all of which are pretty important. So there are like a bunch of these different handlers. There's the context, the hook stuff. All of it kind of makes sense. There's this piece of like, which I think I'd want to go into, is like where we're shifting responsibility from the stacks code to the functions themselves a little bit. That also kind of makes sense. But there are a few of these that, like, the moment I sort of saw it, I'm like looking at it, I'm going, yeah, this seems like a step that we've wanted to take for a long time. Again, I don't know if we're like totally there yet, but it definitely is something that signals kind of the beginning of like an actual application framework. And like, there are many different ways we can go about this. One is just like, hey, it's just, your like regular Lambda functions, we're just giving you helpers. To all the way to the point where like you almost forget you're writing Lambda functions. There's like a sort of vast spectrum there. But yeah, so that's kind of where it is that like, I think we want to be intentional in how we go about releasing these, and whether or not, we do all of that up front is like secondary. It's just like, are we in the right mindset for what we're trying to do moving forward? And so, yeah,
like
that's maybe what I want to go over.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying to me sounds like too abstract. I don't exactly know where to start talking about that. Would it be a good idea if, because if you just look at right, can we merge the stat code and the application code? I don't know, we don't have a rubric on like, and be like, okay, I think this is a good design versus some other design. I feel like it's really hard to come to a conclusion on like,
wait, hold on,
we're
live?
Yeah, we're live.
You're telling me I've been eating all this time on stream? Yeah. It's fine.
People have been enjoying it.
It's a little too noisy for that, I think.
Right, like, but I want to start with like, what was your biggest issue with the code snippet Dax shared yesterday, and from like our conversation at lunch yesterday, it felt it was to the user, when they look at stat code, it'd be like we're just adding a route, that's handling like a proxy plus route, and the handler, it doesn't, there's no indication anywhere is that when you go implement the handler, you need to import SST/node and then import create auth handler, right? There's like user might not even know that, and that's a part you felt was weird, right? Like we're inventing this new route and we are inventing this new handler where like you don't get an error in your editor if you didn't do use auth handler.
Yep.
Yeah, I think for me, I thought about it too, and I think the document Frank put together was helpful for me to like really understand it. I think there's a few different things here, and we can maybe think about them somewhat separately. There is, okay, we're going to be providing an application framework. What is like the perception of like our angle on this, right? So I think it's something like we're providing a framework to build applications using functions. And like maybe that's too specific, but like roughly that's what we're doing. It's a way for you to, instead of building a single big thing, this is a way where you write functions, they react to events, like everything's more event driven. That's like the core difference between this framework and literally anything else, right? Like Rails, Phoenix, etc. Like those are all frameworks around building an HTTP server, very specific to that. Ours is more around building event-driven systems. So if we define it like that, the question becomes, okay, when people hear that and they understand that, what do they expect to find in our framework? And you imagine they expect to find a bunch of utilities and building these things that react to events, like building these little functions that react to events. So I think that's one thing. Like, how do we, assuming that's the concept we're doing, and like assuming like all of that makes sense, like how do we structure our framework to make it look like that? Then a separate thing is specifically the extreme of like moving everything out of Stacks code, or like moving a lot out of Stacks code and doing it all in the application. That to me feels like such an extreme paradigm shift that I think it can make sense, but that's like a whole new product almost. Like I would want to think about that from ground up. I wouldn't want to think about it as like, okay, here's what we have now and here's how you're gonna drive. It feels like too different to me. I feel like you end up kind of building maybe something not so great if you try to go that far on top of what we already have. But so I think looking through those examples, like I definitely didn't like moving everything out of Stacks code or moving everything into Stacks code. I imagine if I like sat down and like started from scratch and like from the beginning was like, okay, just define one code base, like one code. It's not two separate like sections of your code, but just one. What would that look like? Then it might be a little different. But today that feels like way too big of a step. Like I can't really wrap my mind around that.
Yeah, that's totally fair. So what I wanted to do today, incidentally, is actually question some of like the fundamental issues that I have with how Lambda function code is sort of written and structured, or organized, or not organized, which is what most people's code bases are like. I think I need to share my screen, but I think I need to restart Chrome here. So I'll rejoin. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, yesterday I was writing out those different solutions, and in hindsight, it's really obvious where if you move everything into application code and if you versus move everything into stack code, it's actually the same code.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah. Also, I felt like it didn't feel like a breaking change when we actually move all the code into stack code, where right now stack, let's say the API takes a handler, right? It could take, a function that would just be another way of doing stuff. But
Yeah, I think if I imagine like just what's like a totally unified thing, I imagine being able to create infrastructure in core. So in the core folder, some of those files would like spin up queues and stuff. And then I would import those in my other core things and like publish the queue or, write to this Dynamo table. And similarly in the services section, I would import the API from the core and like attach routes to it and stuff. But yeah, that to me feels like a very, very different framework. Like the concept of stacks doesn't even exist there. It's more like just everything. Like why group stuff into stacks there when it's already organized in your core folder?
Yeah.
Oh, let me add Jay.
Grouping into stacks is really just like a weird like CloudFormation limit. Yeah. You know what you described reminds me of our ideal stack where the GraphQL types are like our database types. The GraphQL types are being it's like their own thing where it's being referenced in the backend code, and it's type gen or like code gen in the front end. That's like the source of truth. Where I feel there should be some sort of like shape of your events and stuff are like source of truth, and we import that in your application code, import that in your stack code.
Yeah, exactly. There's the separation, this like discrete separation we have now. It makes sense, but I wonder how necessary it is. Yeah. Like it makes certain things harder, like bridging from one to the other. Like we do a lot of work to try to make that feel like one system, and it doesn't fully feel that way.
All right.
Yeah.
Jay,
yeah. So I think pretty much on that, right? Like if you just take a step back for a second, like typically when you write any sort of application, there's like an entry point to your application. I open up the directory of that project, even just by looking at the source code and the way it's sort of organized, I get a feel for like where I need to work, what does what. And right now, if you kind of think about it, like I just like jotted down a few points here, but the entry point for like an SST app currently is almost like your stacks code. Like you sort of start there, you go, this is the kind of pieces of infrastructure that I have, and this is some parts of this lead to my application code, which is really just like Lambda functions that are sort of getting run. But you can think about the other extreme, which is what most people, when they first try to do Lambda, I feel like they try and do this, which is just shove an Express app, right? An Express, like a complete Express JS app into one Lambda function, and let me handle all the routes inside there. Of course, that's all they do. Like, for like cron jobs and stuff, you obviously don't do, or like async stuff, you don't actually do anything in there. But just for like an API, that is the mindset that they usually come in with. So if I open up my Express sort of like index code or whatever, I kind of get what the routes are. I get what is doing what. And this, like, to an extent kind of makes sense in that it's actually similar to like what we have with the ideal stack now, where like if I open up the functions directory, I can see like, and that's sort of what I was kind of like linking here to, is like the services functions directory shows me, hey, there's like a GraphQL thing, and potentially I could have like different types. These aren't domains per se, but like, these are like different types of I don't quite want to call it events, but you can like think of it that way maybe, or like different types of infrastructure that my application is made of, right? So you can imagine the source code of your serverless application is organized in this way. Like you've got sort of GraphQL, cron jobs, queues, events, or step functions. And presumably, when I go into each of those directories, that is the part of the application that I'm going to be working in. And this is the more sort of like familiar approach to most people. Let me just maybe like pause there really quickly. Does that make sense to you guys? Like if I had one Express app that was shoved into one fat Lambda function, the source code for it would be organized in a way that makes sense to existing developers effectively. Right?
Yeah. This definitely makes sense. And it's kind of what I was kind of hoping we can get to this direction where the functions folder has a very consistent structure, no matter look across 10 different companies, like that folder looks the same. And if it's like kind of opinionated where it needs to be structured a certain way, there's more stuff we can do automatically. And that's that like convention over configuration thing. I think somebody even brought that up earlier today after watching the stream from yesterday. Yeah, like I would love for the auth handler to always be in the same place in everyone's code base, no matter what. Is there a good reason to move it around? I don't know if there is. GraphQL should always be in the same place. Some of the other ones are tricky, like the events.
Yeah, I was making those ones up. Yeah,
you want to break them up by the domain, but even that you can have an events folder, which a file for each of. You know, you can split it up into multiple files to split up your event handlers, or like even subfolders in there. Like the first level of functions, like all directories in the first level underneath the functions directory, like can all those look exactly the same for every single person?
Yeah. Frank, does that make sense to you? Like this approach?
Yeah.
The issue though is that there is nothing aside from the Express example or the GraphQL example. The rest of them, there isn't anything in Lambda function or even like serverless architecture that requires you to do that, right? So it's like totally up to you, right? And this is, I think, what the core of the issue that a lot of people have when they come into Lambda is like when it gets to a certain size, like how do I actually organize this? And like literally there's like you can do whatever you want is what it is. Because there is no, like I said, there's nothing specific to serverless architecture that should drive you in a certain way of organizing your code. And two, there actually doesn't exist like a framework, right? The GraphQL and Express one is limited to sort of the API domains primarily in the serverless world. There isn't an overarching sort of framework that dictates that things should be organized in a certain way. But my point with this approach is that this is kind of what people are used to. This is kind of what people are expecting. But when they come in and see like a code base, or when they start working with it, the existing tooling doesn't guide them in this way. And again, there's actually no reason why you should do it this way. And I don't know if that sort of makes sense, but let me sort of move ahead. So the flip side is this approach, which is the entry point is always your infrastructure, right? So you start by, whether it's, in sort of our past lives, it was like the serverless YAML file, or in our case, it's like you go through like our stacks code. You basically look very clearly at, here's my infrastructure, and at every point when I see sort of a functional handler, I kind of look at and I go, oh, that is triggering some application code on my side. Here you kind of treat, you could potentially, so in this case, I don't want to have like a fat Lambda per se, right? I have all my routes defined in my infrastructure code, and each sort of route points to like a quote unquote dummy Lambda function that just handles that event. And again, the thinking here is like we are only dealing with Lambda functions here. We're only dealing with Lambda function events. And everybody, and this is kind of the point I was making here, is like everybody has kind of their pet way of organizing all of that code. It's the stacks code that is organized in a specific way. The rest is sort of up to you. This is kind of where I think people are, is that most people either doing sort of serverless framework or even like doing some of our stuff, obviously without the ideal stack. Is my previous point is that you organize the infrastructure in a certain way, but kind of the Lambda part of it is like not a free for all, but like, you know, it's like whatever works within your company, within your team. So this is the, if I was to sort of put this is the traditional like serverless way of doing things, even though, you know, there isn't like a specific way. It's just that's what most people end up doing. Does this resonate with you guys? Like the idea that is.
Yeah, I think I agree. Like we're 100% an option two. Well, this is like the current state of things, and I have no idea what to expect when I look at people's code outside of the stacks code. It's all sorts of things, which I think like there's a question of like, yeah, there's a range of some people do it really well and some people do it poorly. But there's also a spectrum of like, I struggle to imagine a structure that makes complete sense for everyone. Like I think what I have currently in my application is I'm not doing anything that like I'm doing my structure is pretty simple and it's very like rigid also. And so far nothing I've needed to do breaks that. But I can like imagine situations where someone has like some like workflow in their application they're implementing, and that involves like publishing to an event bus, like sending that to a queue, pulling it off the queue, like triggering a step function. I can see why like they might choose to model all of that together as one thing, as opposed to like split it by all the queue stuff goes here and all the step function stuff here goes here and all the etc. So yeah, like I don't like as of now I don't like I have a pattern I follow, but like I don't know if I would enforce that pattern.
Yeah. So the way I like separate before I ask you, but the way I sort of separate these two is like on one side, as a developer, when you start to work on things, what do you go look at first? Like, what's your sort of source of truth for the entry point or whatever? And in the first approach, like kind of the express fat lambda approach or whatever, it is that code, right? Like you go into that to add routes to. Again, I'm specifically just looking at Express in this case without touching some of the other ones. But that's just to like drive the point that like if you put a lot of the sort of handling on your Lambda side, then that'll be your entry point. Whereas what traditionally serverless folks tend to do is the entry point is the infrastructure part. That's where you look at and you go, what is calling what? And the question I think you had, Frank, in your document was like, how do I know what is triggering what? So currently, that's how you do it. Right? Currently, you go look at the stacks code to figure out, you know, how a certain specific Lambda function file is getting called, or like where it's getting called.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like I see what you mean, and there's this feeling where, oh, right now every single Lambda function is like a node project on its own, you know, with their own package.json, right? Why can't the whole thing be? I think you were saying yesterday. Why can't the whole thing be just one project with a bunch of export where you're just building the application once, and now you just have a bunch of export where you could map to. I see what you mean, and it is probably better, but I guess it hasn't been like a pain point for me where unless I try it, I use it for a bit. I mean, okay, this is easier. just visualizing it, I can't immediately be like,
Yeah,
I see a clear
I
solution.
can't really imagine it either. I just know if I like broadly think about what is it that I want, um, I don't really want these two separate things where like I have an infrastructure project and an application project. I want to be able to do everything in one. I want like if I do like a go-to reference from one place, like in my editor, like it should be able to go into stuff that's infrastructure, that's like technically infrastructure.
Yeah.
Like it feels natural because there's like a clear division of, oh, infrastructure goes into stacks code and other non-infrastructure stuff goes into application code. But what is infrastructure and what's not infrastructure is also just kind of arbitrary. Like historically, your routes would have not been infrastructure.
Yeah.
But now routes are infrastructure. So they just got moved over. But there's like nothing, but conceptually, like you didn't really want to change the way you were doing routes. You just wanted like the way it was deployed to change. You didn't really care about the way you organized it. Yeah, like when I looked at the Firebase stuff, that kind of looked a little closer to what I think I want. Again, I don't know if I actually want it, but I think I want it. Where they define a handler and they define all the technically infrastructure stuff in that same file, like right on the, like right next to where you're implementing the logic for the handler. This is a function. It needs this much memory. It needs this blah, blah, blah. Here's the implementation of it.
Yeah. Yeah, on that point, like Frank sort of references already, but I'll just mention it. I'm not specifically looking for a solution per se today, but the thing that Frank mentioned that I was telling him yesterday about was like, I've always found it weird that the idea is your every Lambda function is like a zip file. It's fine. But somehow when you're, and it's obviously like packaged and bundled on its own, but when you're working on it, you don't treat it as like separate node projects. You treat all of your Lambda functions, or at least some of them, like in the directory that they sit is one. And again, just talking about node here, you think about that as just one node project, and there are a bunch of handlers in there that that you can point to that will package and build for you, but all of them are sitting in one node project. And then there's obviously this part that, like Dax, I think you brought up a while back, which is like, right, why is CDK doing sort of the packaging and bundling of that as a part of the kind of the deploy process? Yeah, I don't know if you've thought about that specifically.
Sorry, thought about which part?
So this idea that like each function gets bundled and packaged separately, but they all sit together. Usually they all sit together as one node project, where they could be completely separate node projects. Even that like the way you organize that is also arbitrary. That's totally up to you, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's just some of this I think is kind of subjective. I feel like a lot of the CDK patterns and like infrastructure patterns that like showed up in the Lambda world at the beginning came from this like microservices mindset. So you kind of see like some of that where yeah, like you treat every function as its own thing, and there's of course benefits to doing that, but I think in practice, like very few people really get the advantage of like that mindset. I still have not built anything where I feel like I want to treat this as like a bunch of separate applications. It's one big application that all with a bunch of little components, but they all coordinate together. So for me, it's always been, I want this to feel like one project. It can get deployed in this super granular way, whether it's like a bunch of functions that are all reacting to events. Like that's amazing. But yeah, I don't need like this discrete separation. I mean, even in the beginning when I first joined SST, one of the earliest things I was trying to figure out was a monorepo structure, and I was like, okay, what are the actual advantages to separating each function into its own package, or even separating like your core from your services into two packages? And I basically found zero benefits to doing that. You actually lose a lot by doing that, and usually don't find out till later because it seems like it just seems innately obvious. Like, oh, I have different things, I should make discrete boundaries. But there was a time where people felt this way about GitHub repos too. I remember this exact same conversation where people felt like it was innately disorganized to put your backend and your front end in the same repo. And it used to be like a struggle for me to like try to convince people that that was okay. And now fast forward, like people kind of realize, I think it's a lot more popular. So I think people kind of look for these boundaries a little too instinctively because it feels like organization, but it often isn't.
I mean, this one, there's like specific ergonomics, right? Like, so because your Lambda functions are all, typically if you are using like single purpose Lambda functions and they're getting packaged and bundled separately, it like makes sense that each one is its own node app, right? Like its own dependencies or whatever. But from a day-to-day experience perspective, that actually doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's like, do you really care so much about having different dependencies across different functions? And you lose the ability to like, if they're sharing code in a shared module, you should be able to use a TypeScript rename and have that get updated and everywhere that's referencing it. Like that stuff comes up way more often day to day than like crazy isolation needs.
Yeah, in the early days, people aren't like tree shaking and stuff, right? You're just
they're just zipping it up,
each handler has a package JSON, right? You just npm install that and then zip up the folder. That's why you need to keep everything in their own.
Which is why, go ahead.
I was gonna say, this is like, I see a lot of parallels to this, and actually not exactly what a parallel is, but the idea here is you build something in a simple way, but there's a compilation step that deploys it in an efficient way.
Right.
That can be separated. I think like if you look at some of the front end frameworks.
Yeah, code splitting, right?
Yeah, code splitting, and like even like something like Svelte where like you write a very simple application that looks like just like, not looks like, but it feels like React, where like, oh, the UI is bound to the variable and it updates. But there's a crazy compiler step that figures out, oh, here's what you're trying to do. Let me make it hyper efficient in all these ways. And they're not forcing you to write code in a certain way and like do that manually. They're like, there's a compilation step that's smart. I think we have that more now. So there's like less of a need to enforce all this isolation and treat everything like its own little project.
Yeah. So this is the part that's so what Frank was having. This is what I was like bringing up to him. Again, I don't have it on here because I wasn't planning to like necessarily talk about it. But my middle ground between these two approaches is kind of that, well, okay, so if we're just assuming that all your Lambda function code, like all of them together, sit in the same node app, and you're basically just like pointing to specific handler, like specific files within it to respond to certain events, well, then you can kind of enforce some sort of structure for that node app. And again, I haven't like totally thought this through, but if I was to look at the source code for that node app, that should potentially look similar across the board for different teams, right? Which is kind of where we're getting at with the ideal stack. I wonder if you can take it a step further, where that node app is a quote unquote like SST Lambda app that at deploy time gets split up and deployed efficiently. Like it could be deployed as, you know, a big fat sort of Lambda. You could run it locally, as like a single app, right? Because like if you wanted to potentially, because it's just a Node app. And now like the developer experience around and on organizing your code around that is more intuitive to people because it's just sort of a regular Node app. So that's kind of what I was proposing to Frank. When I look at like these two, I go like, why isn't there sort of a middle ground? The idea kind of there being, I should just be able to look at this Node app to figure out the architecture of my application. Anyway, yeah, that's
right. I guess that's why people they start by writing some of the frameworks, right? Start by looking at like an Express app, right? Just within the scope of an API. Take a Express app, reverse engineer, and then create a stack out of it, right? I mean, you lose a bunch of things like customizing like per route and stuff, but that's the angle, right? They take, right? You just have this one Express app.
yeah.
I guess
Yeah.
I think there have been some approach people have taken, right? They try to reverse engineer like WordPress and deploy that to Lambda, not as a fat Lambda, but as like individual Lambdas. But
Oh,
to the
interesting.
end user, you just take a WordPress app in.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think this goes back to the thing I was mentioning in the beginning. Like, what is a pattern of what is like the overall pattern of this framework? And like that's the pattern you're doing. The fact that it's being deployed onto AWS Lambdas that are like split up in this way is like an implementation detail almost.
Yep.
Yeah, and to me, like I said, the closest thing I can think of is like this is like an event-based thing. If you look at some of the other frameworks, where they all fall short is they have excellent APIs for building an API, an HTTP API, but as soon as there's like asynchronous stuff like a cron job or a queue or an event or some kind of event bus thing, you kind of have to bring in a lot of external things. If I think about Phoenix, like everyone was using this other library called Oban, which added like some of the event bus and queuing stuff, and that then you got to like bring in, you have to like connect that to like your Postgres thing so they can like save state somewhere. Same for like cron job. Like all this stuff was kind of that needs additional infrastructure, so it was harder to bring in like any kind of pub sub thing. You had to do. You had to like deploy like a RabbitMQ or something. So if our concept is we do everything event based and that all feels first class in our framework, that then when we think about designing our API, like that could be the angle. And then we just have to make sure that we can actually implement that in a way where we can deploy that well.
Yeah. I never thought like SST is like serverless specific, right? I feel like it's more like a app framework that
Right.
let you use these managed services, right? There hasn't been like an app framework that lets you use like Rails, right? If you want to do RabbitMQ, you have to host it, or like you have to use a bunch of these plugins. Yeah, Lambda just happened to be this one thing that we use, but there's I totally agree with Dax's angle.
Yeah. So if I think about the sort of like middle ground approach a little bit more, is like right now it to me that seems so we're sort of there. It seems a little odd that it's just like I'm just pointing to sort of functions in this bigger, or like these files in this bigger node project. And then you're thinking about like, oh, I need all of these guys to process events, add context, right? As we're talking about like hooks. But if for a second I didn't look at our stacks code and just looked at the functions directory, I can't quite make out what is going on. Like I still need my stacks code as sort of an entry point to figure out what is being triggered.
Mm-hmm.
Would you feel that way if the functions code, like the API routes, had the API routes in the function? If the event bus handlers had like the event they were subscribing to in that same file?
Sort of. The version that I had in mind, again, the reason I didn't want to bring this up totally is like I don't want to like dive too deep into that design specifically,
Right.
because I haven't like thought it through. But the one way I can think about this is like, imagine like the index file. I think this is kind of maybe what Frank had put down on the doc there, but the index file of this node project exports everything, all the sort of, again, it won't be quite domains, right? But like I guess like family of events, and the sort of different family of events that they sort of respond to. Again, haven't totally thought this through, but it would almost, what I'm looking for in some ways is like, can you take all these Lambda function files and kind of like tie them together so that when I look at the app, I understand what the entire app does. And then when it gets deployed, obviously they're getting splintered, which doesn't matter to me. Yeah.
You're saying like an index file that has a list of all the functions, all the exported functions.
Yeah, and like the context being added to them is also something that I see again, and I haven't like totally thought this through, but like because so if you just sort of visualize, it's like a bunch of these Lambda function handlers in parallel. Each one of them is sort of adding context, right? When I open up this directory, I don't have an idea of how this app is sort of structured. It would just make sense to me if you actually just gave me a node app, handled like the incoming raw event, added the context, put the hooks in, and then it gets routed to whatever family of event handlers that it's supposed to handle. But as a whole, this is like a regular node app to me. Yeah, again, I didn't want to step into this, but like if you know, it is maybe worth putting out there in terms of like, does that resonate with you guys?
One part that kind of resonated is yesterday, after this conversation, I was trying to describe you. I'm like, all right, I'm about to work on config. And the secrets made sense. With parameter, the whole thing is to make sure the reason we have the parameter class is so that we make sure that you don't have this different Lambda have same environment names with different values, right? That was Dexter saying. And Jay said that's the exact same problem we're trying to solve here, where if you consider the whole thing as an app and you have all these parameters, and then it doesn't make sense that you have different values for those parameters.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
when I kind of click. I'm like, yeah, maybe it does make sense too.
Yeah, it is the same thing, because the reason I discovered that problem was because for writing tests, because in the testing environment, it kind of needs to be treated as like a monolith, like it's one test runner that's running. It's not that's accessing all parts of your system. It's not like this broken up thing with isolated scope, and that forces you to name the variables in a certain way. Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely all related.
But this one's weird, right? It's like, again, like if I look at that issue, it's like the tooling that you're using for testing is treating this as like a node app, right? Like, but how they're being deployed and the context in which they run, they're not, right? And it's like, yeah, the other thing I was sort of telling Frank is like, it's not like a showstopper type of an issue. Like, obviously, people still do work and everything's totally fine. But it's really odd to me.
At the end of this, I really see someone make a pull request, be like, how do I deploy SST on container?
Right. Have you guys considered Kubernetes?
Yeah, the other thing I was thinking about was, so I think the goal is you want to be able to, what's the least you have to look at to understand how the whole app comes together. Another way to think about that is, can the system automatically generate, like what's the least amount of information the system needs to automatically generate something that describes how the app works? So if you imagine like a visual, like let's say you were building something to visualize all the events in your system, where they come in, etc. That you like, if you can solve that problem, you've kind of also solved like a person coming in and understanding it, because it's like the automated one is just doing what the person would understand manually. Yeah, like I would love to see, oh, when there's an auth start event that happens, like here's a handler that triggers, and then there's an auth callback event that happens, here's what happens, and then yeah, it's kind of being able to wrap your head around all of that with as little, looking through as few files and stuff as possible.
Yeah, I mean, you think about like the two analogies here. In the front end world, obviously, it's like it's not this, but a similar problem was sort of solved with the component tree, right? So like it like neatly expands, right? Like it starts with the index files, like slowly expands into everything else.
Yeah.
In the sort of express world, it's like, yeah, I can see all the routes sort of defined in one spot. And all the sort of middleware that goes with it, like whatever you kind of want, is like sort of sits there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a comment that someone left that they said they're organizing stuff by like kind of like by type. So a subfolder for your API routes, a subfolder for your step functions, a subfolder for cron jobs, etc. And that's actually also how I've organized. I don't have anything besides, I don't have that much. I just really have event bus handlers.
Yeah.
And those are
Yeah,
all
these
together.
aren't exactly, they aren't like domains. They're just like similar sort of infrastructure or like similar event types.
Yeah, and you can always break it down by domain inside there. The thing I wonder is, does that feel really weird? Like, in what situations does that feel really weird, and is that situation common? I don't think it's common, because I personally have not hit it yet, but I can like kind of imagine it.
Hey, what situation being weird?
Like if organizing by the kind of like infrastructure type, that might be weird for people that want to organize it by domain, because they're coordinating a workflow across multiple infrastructure types. The thing is, I've seen actually Phoenix is a good example. I don't remember exactly what they did, but it's the same category. There's a situation, especially with a GraphQL, their recommended way of organizing is you kind of split up things by like, again, kind of similar to us, by like the type of thing it is, as opposed to grouping it by, so you group stuff together by the type of thing it is, not like the business concept. You don't group it by business concept when it comes to like the GraphQL side of things. And some people found that weird, but that is a pattern they followed. Like all your resolvers go here, all of your types go here, all of your et cetera goes here.
Yeah. So coming back to this one, and I just look at sort of option 1 and option 2, which is like the source of truth is the Lambda functions. The source of truth is like the infrastructure, or the source of truth is kind of like your Lambda functions, or the sort of the directory where all the Lambda functions sort of sit. I don't think it's a good idea to mix the two. Like the system that we have now it favors people that are used to doing serverless, or like have some idea of sort of serverless, and they start with looking at the stacks code and kind of goes from there. To round this out, like in terms of like points that I sort of had, and this maybe touches on like what was going through my mind yesterday when I was like looking at what we were putting together is so I think if we were to sort of do a big bang release of, you know, the hooks, the context of these handlers, it might make sense to have a cohesive idea around how they all tie together when we release them. Because otherwise it's like you're basically not necessarily throwing unrelated concepts together or like concepts that could run independently of each other, but you're giving it to people and letting them kind of figure out, should I use this or not? Whereas if you were to give them hypothetically, right, like an entire kind of like Lambda framework, and a part of the Lambda framework is this like context concept, that's a bit more cohesive to people. That you can explain, you know, why it's sort of necessary or whatever. Or the flip side is you roll out the individual pieces on their own and explain that on its own, giving people a chance to adopt it in the order or like if they want to adopt it or not, effectively. Does that make sense to you guys, like those two sort of ways of doing things?
Yeah, I think the former makes sense to me. I feel like you
Like,
either you adopt everything or not.
well, the latter, one of the reasons I look at the latter is like you could just roll out the context stuff and the hook stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you could just document that, and people could use it right now. They don't have to. They could use it. And then when you put out the handler that relies on the hook stuff, it's like there's a existing thing that they can potentially rely on that they already know. But if you put out the handler with the hook stuff, and then we haven't figured out the story for the other handlers, that feels not uncomfortable to me, but that, and it could play out fine, but that feels a bit more riskier from a design perspective. And primarily because of kind of the last point, which is that something like this, like a Lambda application framework, hasn't actually existed before. What we're doing with the auth handler on some level is basically asking people to write code that runs inside a Lambda function but doesn't look like a Lambda function handler, which is an exciting thing because again, like that hasn't existed before. But there's also like a really good opportunity to like potentially design this from the ground up. And I'm not talking. One of the reasons I didn't want to step into sort of the details is because, yeah, this might end up changing how we deploy your infrastructure, or, you know, the other things that sort of Frank had sort of mentioned. We might end up there. But that isn't the key point to me. The key point here is like, to date, there hasn't been a proper way to organize your Lambda function code, especially node projects. We're beginning to introduce some sort of primitives that would eventually fit into kind of a bigger picture of a framework. It feels a little risky to me if we don't have a sense of the shape of the framework before we launch these things. So two approaches: you figure out the shape, launch everything together, or launch standalone pieces that people can kind of use. And going back to my original point about the two different approaches, if you were to release a handler and you haven't figured out the entire shape of like what the whole thing will look like, you know, maybe pick sort of a safer design choice. And we can go into sort of details with that one. Like I had some ideas there, but let me pause.
Yeah, I think the challenge for me is the way I've been working so far is my own code base is always slightly better than
Yeah.
like SST, because like all the newest ideas are there, and then someone that graduates and gets put into SST. Um, right now, my code base is not as good as what we're talking about here. Like I haven't like gotten it to that level of organization yet. So I don't know. Like I think that'll happen, but I don't know when it'll happen. Like if you look back at the functional stacks, there was a point where I like demoed it to you guys or like mentioned it more seriously to you guys. I don't know if you remember, but like 5 months before that, I was like, "Oh, like wouldn't this be really weird if we did this?" And it was like I don't even think the code that I shared really worked or made sense, but the idea I had was, oh, like you can create like a dummy stack and change the interface with how you do it. But it took me a while before like that all clicked together into what functional stacks are now. So I kind of feel similarly where I'm like, okay, like there's something here, but it's not gonna. I don't know when it's gonna click
Yeah.
together. Like even in this conversation, I feel like I'm looking at the auth API and I'm like, what you said just now was interesting. You said this auth handler doesn't look like a typical Lambda function handler, and that's right, and that's a good thing because like we're doing something new. But I actually am not realizing it looks too much not like a normal Lambda function handler. And if our concept is like we're doing like this event framework, like a small tweak to that handler should be instead of a single config for every single provider, you should probably export a function for each provider you're adding. Like here's my Google handler, here's my Twitter handler, here's my custom handler, and that feels more like this event thing, and that would make it look more like how the event bus version of this might look like, the API version of this might look like.
Mm. Yeah.
So yeah, I think ultimately I'm definitely on board with there's this larger thing that I think we like are kind of like walking around the edges of, and that's going to influence what like the specific problems we're solving today, what they look like. But I think realistically at some point it's going to click and there's going to be, hopefully it's not like a major shift, but it might be like somewhat of a shift, especially if it like clicks with some of the like merging the stacks and the application stuff together.
Yeah. This is kind of go ahead, Frank.
I think my takeaway from what Dak said is like it's actually not possible to figure out the overall shape now. I think to figure out the overall shape, we pretty much need to implement everything, anyways. And if we are going to implement them in order to figure out the overall shape, it doesn't make sense that we just implement them without releasing them, right?
Say that last point again.
It doesn't make sense that we implement auth. Okay, so our auth handler, the file will have export Facebook, export Google, whatever, right? And now we implement, not releasing that, we implement event bus, right? All that. We implement that the secrets and parameter stuff. We're not releasing it because we're not sure if parameter is going to be this app level thing, right? Not releasing, I think doesn't make sense in this case. If you will be working for too long without releasing stuff, um,
Yeah, I'm like thinking back to like the previous framework I worked on, plus some of the other frameworks that I've been a part of from like the early days, and yeah, almost all of them, like both of them got to like a very refined place. It was very cohesive and it like looked like what we're describing, but that like took a long time, and I'm not sure how. Like I want that now. Like I'm like, this doesn't feel cohesive enough. Like I remember how stuff could feel really cohesive, and I want it now. But
does it usually happen from us using it internally, or would it like come from like the feedback from community? What do you feel?
I don't think it takes a lot of people using it to refine it. So as long as you have like a really high bar on what you're willing to tolerate, I think like of course there's going to be a lot of help from other people using it, but typically external people using a framework, they tend not to be as critical,
Mhm.
because one, it's like maybe an awkward thing to do to be that critical, and two, it's typically it's like good enough and it's solving their problems and they're happy with it. Whereas our own bar will be a lot higher. Like I'm sure like people will be looking at stuff we're talking about right now and think that sounds nice, but they care more about having auth in any form. Whereas for us, like we're just gonna care more. We're just gonna be more critical of this is good, but it's definitely not it.
Mhm.
Yeah, this is kind of why I put down sort of the last point, which is that like, which is what I had a feeling that we would sort of settle on is, I think we can consider this as, demo zero of, it's not really a demo, but like meeting zero of our Lambda application framework idea. And it makes sense to, I think, shift into a mindset where this is kind of what we're angling towards. And now it'll help. It's basically like, if you don't know what you're looking for, like it's going to be hard to sort of come across it. So we're probably going to need sort of inspiration from other places, right? So like when you're doing some of the hook stuff, you were sort of talking about how like a lot of the ideas are coming from Solid, right? This is a thing now that I think we want to start doing, which is like looking for a cohesive way to write your Lambda function code. On the point that you're making, Dax, about like making the auth handler look more like a regular Lambda function handler, this is the one that I'd sort of proposed to Frank, not in terms of like what we should actually do, but like if I think about the spectrum. So on one hand, we could go total magic, which is you actually don't know what infrastructure is being deployed. And it literally just like points to this one file, and this is the template of what that file is like. You put your kind of like your logic, you put some config, and then you put kind of like your logic in the on success and so on and so forth. But this is what the file kind of looks like. That's not what you sort of demoed, but I can kind of imagine like going all the way to the extreme. Then there's the like completely dummy way, which is in your stacks code, you have the config. It almost looks like the auth construct that we have now. And I'm not exactly sure if this works for your design, but just hypothetically speaking, the on success could point to an actual Lambda function. So any of the kind of logic bits, like this, and that's sort of like how people think about some of the Cognito stuff is like,
Yeah, you're implementing
anytime,
callbacks. Yeah.
right? So you can think of like sort of these extremes. I don't feel comfortable going towards the extreme of like where we do a lot of the sort of function handling for you until we have a better sense. of where we're heading, but yeah. That said, though, I think even in rolling this out, I still feel more comfortable rolling out hooks and context on its own. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, I think in my head I have to tie these to specific problems that it solves. The only very specific problem I can think of is
This is like the API event parsing stuff.
yeah, but I'm mostly building for GraphQL. I'm imagining like a GraphQL setup for the most part, and you don't need that there because it's already parsed. Like I think longer term, there's like, I mean, maybe this isn't even longer term, but there's like the multi-tenant stuff, like just being able to grab the tenant ID. Like that's people can use hooks for that. I think we should come up with a whole permissions framework so people can. Like I've had a lot of conversations because of this auth thing where everyone is kind of asking, they're kind of expecting to implement like auth at the API level or authorization at the API level. So having a full framework of like letting you do that, not just at the API level, but like even deeper, like that's going to be all hooks based. The auth stuff makes sense. Like if you have the auth thing, like you're going to use the hooks to get the session and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know. Like nothing like immediately jumps to mind as, oh, we were going to release this and people are going to delete a bunch of code in their code base because this will solve that. The event part, like the parsing the API request, like that is very useful. It's just
Yeah, one of the reasons I prefer launching something like this separately is what I feel like I've realized over the last maybe a week or so, even with the remix site launch, is that I think when you separate them and you launch them, it gives us a chance to let's just let's put it bluntly. I think if we had run the remix site launch the way we were originally planning to, right, which was kind of like was going to be sort of like it wasn't going to be Frank's thing, let's say, right? It wouldn't have had. How many likes does it have now, Frank?
But you would have put the SST link in the tweet though.
Well, yeah, fair. But again, like it's coming from you, so you know, in a lot of cases, like, okay, what is this? And they look at your bio, and it's not that bad.
Yeah.
But I think there's something interesting that Dax sort of touched upon this as well. It now allows us to like create content around this thing, right? Like Frank put way more work into the doc, right? We're putting way more work into the launch, and those are things I know we tend to like skip over a little too much. So there is an inherent value in launching some of these things separately, especially when it's a new concept, because it just gives us a chance to like talk about them and explain them better. But yeah, maybe in this case, it only makes sense to talk about the hook stuff in relation to the auth stuff. So I don't know.
Yeah, because for the most part, I don't know if, of course, people are going to be writing their own context things, but that should be like, I feel like that should be somewhat exceptional and somewhat advanced. So if we release just that, we're kind of handing over like what we consider like an advanced user.
Got it.
Tool.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe it ends up going the other way, which is like we launch that separately after, again, you know, even though it's publicly available or whatever.
Yeah, I see that as like we've been using this internally for a bunch of these things. Like here's how you can use it yourself for whatever other stuff you need it for.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. So I think I'll let you guys sort of wrap up on this one, but I think the takeaways for me is like moving forward, we want to start thinking about, and maybe I'm intentionally not being very specific here, but oh yeah, I was reading the comment from Devin. Yeah. Maybe you guys can respond to that, but I'm not totally.
There are some little things that are worth noticing.
Is that as in like things that we should be highlighting more of, or that there's some issues in the docs?
Or does Remix soft launch things? Because I think I have seen stuff that's like experimental. I've even
I
seen
see.
Next.js is this really crazy thing where I saw this yesterday where let me actually just find it so I can. I don't know if we should do this, but I can't find it. But basically, you imported like an API that they had, but it was like prefixed with like a crazy like underscore unstable might change, and then you called it. It's kind of like naming our API gateway v1 a very long name. It's kind of similar.
Yeah. React was doing that for a while, right? Like, So takeaways here for me are like, there is this thing that we're trying to work towards, and I think we need to start looking for potential solutions or potential sources of inspiration. And the core problem is that there isn't a good guideline / reason even to organize your Lambda function code in a specific way. And if you were to just look at your Lambda function source code, you wouldn't be able to make out the shape of the rest of your application. Your starting point ends up being kind of like your infrastructure code. But then, there's some like issues attached to that we kind of like talked about. So that's for like looking ahead in terms of design stuff. What do we need to kind of work on? On the flip side, for the auth thing specifically, I think based on this conversation, I think it makes sense to maybe launch the hooks thing as a thing that comes with the auth thing, but the focus sort of being the auth part. I think until there's a large enough family of hooks, plus a need from the community to want to customize the hooks, and then we kind of like launch that on its own and talk about it on its own. For the auth design, I think it might be worth sort of playing around a design that makes it a little bit more familiar and quote unquote safer, in the sense that like it's not as much of a departure from what we have, until we sort of figure out, where we're kind of headed. And maybe in us playing around with that, we find some, sort of inspiration in like how you want to kind of design it.
Well, I think the safest version of it is kind of what I had, where it's just another route you're attaching to your API.
So you're being explicit on the route, right?
And it's explicitly pointing to what I have today, which is a single function handler.
Yeah, I'm curious for that one, and I need to look at the code again, but like, it didn't occur to me yesterday, but like as I'm thinking through it now, how come like, why don't we want to have more of the config stuff in the stacks?
Yeah, so the reason is because these are two separate things, there's a trade-off with putting it in one place or the other. So if we put all the config in the stacks and just have the on success point to a function, that on success callback cannot be type safe without you being explicit about, oh, you're expecting a Google callback here, or you're expecting. So because I wanted to take advantage of like inferring the types from the config, I needed that the source of truth to be in the application.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this is a type of thing that we'll, I think, run up against.
Yeah, and if I put it in the stacks code,
because the way we kind of do it, like on the front end, because I was thinking this through yesterday. I'm like, wait, if we're going that extreme, why, like, say potentially merging like infrastructure code and your Lambda function code in like actually the same code base, like why isn't the front end in there too? It's like, well, I don't know. It doesn't obviously make sense.
Well, the
but
front
how do we
end
handle
could,
it?
the front end could. I was thinking about this too. Like in the front end, you need to call like auth.start and pass in the provider name. And I was like, this should technically be inferred from your backend so that you get autocomplete on all the options. So like, yeah, like this ultimate thing is it's all unified, and like there's not this like wall of, well, if you put it here, you can't get the types there.
Yeah.
Or you need
Wait,
a
how
code
would you
gen
solve that?
to bridge it, right?
Right. I mean, I don't mind the code gen to bridge it part, because speaking of the GraphQL, like the ideal stack that we have, like it works okay to me. Like you sort of like define the types in like one area, and then yeah, it is being code gen, but like it's available in the front end, right? Yeah. Wait, Dak, so is the auth stuff, are the types available in the front end, or?
Not right now. No, they're not. I didn't plan to try to fix that because it's just like one string and it's not a huge deal. But in terms of like the ultimate vision, like that should just kind of always be the expectation that there's always a source of truth, and everywhere else where you access it, it's inferred from that source of truth.
That way, you would probably need to write like a type file to the node modules, right? Where you're importing.
Yeah, probably. Unless like, but that's not what TRPC does, right? TRPC has a very intentional API that lets you just import the backend code into the front end, but it's a type only import. And then from there, the front end can just, it's just like, is it all inference all the way down? So no code gen.
Yeah,
my problem is, right, if you actually never try it out, like experiment with, right, putting the application code into your stack code, I would never fully realize how good it would be. For example, kind of like the thing Sam was working on, the punch card stuff, right? Like, right, if you have like an event and in the event subscriber, no, sorry, if you have like a, like say API route, and if you reference like an event, a construct you created, you should be able to just do that event dot publish, right? You should already know it's event bus ARN and stuff, right? And if you also could figure out what function you're calling in there, right? So you assign the permission automatically, right? There's a bunch of magic you could do, but if you never, give that a shot, it will always be like this mental thing where it'd be like, right, is there enough benefit, right? Would that be confusing to people? Should we design something from ground up? Yeah.
I think another way to also look at this is because I was saying at the beginning of the call, the infrastructure from code stuff, it's already kind of confusing, and I think that like multiplies the potential areas we can go like even more. Maybe we can constrain this to this Lambda application framework technically does not need SST. If we think about it like that, what would that look like? And can you make something really, really good and only enhanced when you add SST on top, as opposed to like requiring it? Like, does that make sense? Like, is that something we could do? That might be a way to help think about this.
Yeah, that works. Though, just really quickly on the specific point of the auth one, I think given our current design, like what makes sense in some ways is that the stacks code is responsible for generating the types for the backend and the front end. Because that's kind of the pattern that we've been following so far, right? When we think about like,
say it again?
Like the stacks. So you know, like how we do the process.env, like trying to.
That PR never got merged. we don't do that still.
So anyway, that is maybe the starting point for me. Like, so even though maybe that is like the ultimate vision or whatever, that seems pretty attainable now. Basically, it's like single source of truth for your types, right?
The thing is, we actually don't do that anywhere if you think about it, because for GraphQL, the source of truth is in the application services. The place where we do it is for environment variables on the front end. Yeah, you're right. We do.
Right.
Yeah, never mind. Ignore what I said earlier.
But I mean, if we did the config, that does do this or no?
Yeah, the config is the source of truth is the stacks, and everything else consumes it.
I guess on that note, does it matter just from a type perspective? Does it matter what the source of truth is? Should they always come from one area, or is it just the fact that like it's consumable everywhere is more important? Because it seems to me it's the latter, right? It's the fact that it should be consumable everywhere is the more valuable part.
I think. Okay, so if we think about the TRPC example, that is the most like extreme, like ideal way of doing it, where you can literally with an import statement have access to types from a completely different part of your system. Why can we do this today? Like with just an import statement, can we import stuff from stacks code into your application code? I think the issue here is CDK's API design makes this very hard. Like TRPC achieves this with like a very intentional API design that makes this possible. So it's like there's certain patterns you're doing on the back end to make it so your front end can actually infer it. CDK is a constraint there. So that's why we typically are forced into code genning if the source of truth is in CDK. That's why I don't like putting stuff in CDK. It gives us a lot less flexibility. Whereas our application stuff, that works well. The other challenge for us is a lot of these like inference systems, like Pothos and TRPC, they kind of rely on having like a global object everything is stemming from. It's kind of the really only way you can do like have access to all of your types. But because the nature of Lambda, like everything is like fairly isolated and like each Lambda is kind of running on its own, or the code for it kind of feels more isolated. That current pattern doesn't translate well into.
Wait, sorry, say that again. Yeah, go over that one again.
So if you look at TRPC, like they have this concept of procedures. It's just like GraphQL. They can be mutations or queries. But when you define it, you're kind of extending this single TRPC router concept. There's like a single TRPC router you initialize, and then off of that, you define all of your queries and mutations, etc.
Yeah.
And that's what allows you to say, okay, what are all the queries and mutations across my whole app? You can go to that single router that's tying everything together. Same thing with Pothos, right? Pothos has that core builder that you're using in every single file. Again, sort of. But right now, we don't have this core thing that shows up, this global thing that shows up. Like you basically initialize one TRPC router per application. You initialize one Pothos builder per application. For us, there's no like one thing that you're initializing for the whole application. Like each Lambda function is its own separate thing. So we don't like today, we don't have this like design of, oh, like we're really thinking about the API for it to be like imported in the type system to be accessed from all sorts of places. Like we don't have that. I think CDK makes it impossible. I think maybe our application stuff could step in this direction, but again, a little bit harder with Lambda pattern. So yeah, to answer your original question, it technically shouldn't matter where you define the source of truth for the types, but in practice it does, because like there's some other constraints with getting it out and into other places that show up.
Yeah, I think this might end up being kind of the core thing in some ways, or at least one of the core things that we want to kind of decide. So going back to your question of like, what if we just thought about the sort of Lambda framework as like sort of standalone outside of the infrastructure? Like this is probably the thing is what I kind of want is the types and the autocomplete to work from the infrastructure on. So whether we did it the way you were sort of saying, where standalone it works great, but within SST it works even better because you can get a bunch of stuff from the infrastructure. That works. That thing that makes sense. But even again, coming back to like the auth thing, I think even with the auth case, we still need. We'd want to figure out the type stuff in a way that is, I guess, closer to what we're doing. Is my gut feeling. I don't know. Yeah. Like what we've done so far, I guess. Or like, is it worth just fixing that part of the problem? Like I obviously I haven't looked at this enough or know enough. But if we just look at this issue of like, I want to make sure that I share types across the board. SST app right now, right? Like what is the sort of best way to do that? And is that worth sort of solving?
Yeah, that's it's like another dimension to this problem. I think that one, like I do want to solve that. I think there's certain places where it's a lot more valuable than others. Like doing that for GraphQL, really valuable because your front end's always querying an increasingly complex API and you want to be able to explore that from the front end. Doing it for auth, not as valuable because like you're going to implement this once and like never touch that code again. It's going to be like one of 3 options that you can pick in your autocomplete.
Yep.
But that framing is I'm only framing it that way because of what we have today. If theoretically we had a consistent pattern that made everything type safe always, then everything is just, you kind of can have this expectation everywhere. It doesn't matter that it's less useful one place and more useful in another because it's following a consistent pattern.
I feel strongly about this one because now we're beginning to talk about SST that way. And right, like it's true in the sense that we're like patching it together. But yeah, I don't feel like we've got like a solid understanding of like, or a solid framework on how that's sort of built.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For the config one, we kind of know what we're going to do for the type stuff already, or is that figured out?
Yeah.
That's gonna be CodeGen, yeah.
Wait, what config stuff? The stuff I'm working on?
Yeah.
The prototype I shared has CodeGen. It's pretty simple.
Like CodeGen for
So the config is defined in the stacks.
And you should be able to access your variables in your Lambda code.
It's like autocomplete there, right?
oh we're CodeGenning like a type file into
Yeah, just exactly the same way as the front end.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Because that is interesting what you're saying, Dax, that like you opted to design it this way because it's harder to get types across from the stack stuff to the thing. That's not good. Right? Like that's not good in the sense that like that like mentally blocks certain designs.
Yeah, and it's like not just that, it's also the fact that the Sax code is built a certain way. So if it's like importing stuff that like certain stuff, if stuff gets imported into the Sax code, then like it'll break when it's bundling. Yeah, that's why the ultimate thing I still feel like is you remove this layer where it's like a separate infrastructure project. But yeah, I don't know how that looks like. And like Frank mentioned, like we can look at punch card and look at that extreme, and we can think about why we personally don't use it, like why, like what's limiting about it.
Yeah.
Like that's like an effective, that's like a good solution to what we're describing. Like someone's implemented that.
Yeah. I don't know if you saw Kevin's last comment here. That is a type of thing that I kind of want as well. So when I look back at like the handler stuff that we were looking at yesterday, what I sort of want is that my Lambda function should be aware of the type of handlers that I can use. It's like I can't use the auth handler because I don't have the auth construct. Like it's aware of the infrastructure, and in this case, I'm assuming that's what this sort of means. Like when it says my table, that's the name that was used in the infrastructure.
Oh, that's the object you created in infrastructure, right?
Yeah, I mean what you're actually looking for is just a table name, so you can feed it into your ORM or whatever your query builder that you're using.
Yeah, I guess the other side of this for the auth one, I think we'll wrap up here maybe. Yeah, because this thing is a bit worrying to me, where like we're forced to pick designs because we obviously want the type inference, but we're forced to pick it because there's a wall between the two. Yeah. Does that bother you? Is that a thing that like moving forward you feel like is a thing as well?
I think right now, if I like rank my problems, there's capabilities. Like right now, I like don't consider Cognito a solution, so I don't have an auth solution. So I want that capability in any form. The next level of issue for me is I feel like for trivial things, I need to hop between my stacks code and my application code, and I would like that to go away. It feels very expensive to add another like event bus subscription, so I don't use it as much, and I like kind of cram stuff into the same handler even though I shouldn't, because it just feels like heavy. Those two are like my primary thing. The type safety stuff, I'm like I said, the most important parts are there if config gets added. Everything else feels more like I feel like we can get, just with those first two things, we can get to a place where people will use it, and I don't think anyone will come back with anything critical. I think to get to the next level, it's going to be us having to be like critical about it. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I think that makes sense to me. When I look at sort of the priorities, I guess the thing I would kind of add to that is like there is the priorities that you have in terms of a user of SST, and then there's the priorities that you have in terms of obviously like a person that is building on SST, right? So if you feel like there are things that are limiting what you could potentially design or build, like that, probably take that a bit more seriously.
Yeah, I mean, if I zoom out even more, like we're talking about just the scope of this feels like a big scope, but it's actually pretty narrow. It's like we're not even including like the CLI and like the console and all that other stuff. But I really factor that stuff in. Like I care about some of those things more than some of the things that we brought up here. Like a faster CLI is like more important to me than better type safety, like more type safety than we currently have.
Okay, so we, right, the auth stuff is not being blocked by this decision, right?
No, I think it's okay.
Yeah, we should release. Yeah.
Well, I still kind of need to figure out what flavor of this to do.
Let's maybe look at like potential options. I don't mind going for something that is safer or easier to understand given the current setup of SST. Knowing that in the future we're, when we kind of redo the sort of Lambda piece, that this might get redone.
Yeah, definitely lean towards the current implementation than having the config in stack and then expose on success, right? That one you're just introducing a new kind of handler. This is just straight up Lambda handler, and we're providing a helper, right?
I don't know if I want to consider the stacks version, because I feel like there's like way too much that breaks with that. I think I can just write it off just from just thinking about it here. But I think I can like give some options on. So like within the realm of most of it being defined in your application, like there's still some different options. And there's some other stuff too that I haven't even gotten to, but I will need to. So at some point, you're going to need to get the session information in your application. And at some point, you're going to need to reject something like this person is not allowed to do this thing. That brings up the whole concept of errors. Like we don't have, and I don't think I've seen anyone have a good way to do errors. So that's going to be its own thing. Like what's our version? What's our take on errors and like throwing them and getting those formatted in right ways? And
yeah, I mean that falls under the bracket of
an
application framework type thing as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
we're good.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and so next step, is to evaluate some of the other designs, and then maybe just like finalize it and release it.
Yeah, I think we probably will have similar type of conversation on and off throughout the rest of the event bus and stuff. But I feel probably we'll all be like enlightened one day when be like Dax sent a message say, okay, I see how it all work together. Yeah. I think that we're on the right path. My only worry is that we're not trying. I don't know what is the right protocol within our team to be like, how do we evaluate some of these the bigger things where that doing the cloud formation engine, right? That's something we all agree is like down the road. But this merging the stack and application code, we keep talking about it, but it doesn't feel like we have new insight every time we talk about it. Are we just keep going to talk about it, or like wait to see what other people are building around it, and maybe that would be approach, right? Just I feel like we just need to say it out. What our approach are like towards those type of things.
Yeah, my feeling right now is I want to what I have for auth roughly what I have, it's gonna be refined. Ship that. I want to do the event bus also. Ship that, and then I think at the end of that, like do the event bus process. We're probably gonna have similar conversations like this.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like that's like stimulus to like try to get to this final state. Like if we do a few of these, we'll know where we want to go, and we might end up deciding like there actually is no place to go. Like this is as good as it gets. But yeah, we like need more stimulus than just this auth example, I think.
Yeah, and the other one is this the types thing. I think, sort of goes hand in hand with it, but yeah.
Yeah, okay. And like I said, I also think we should try to rank the priority of like the capabilities versus I almost want to call it ergonomics. Like these are all important, but if I think about the missing capabilities we have, like real time, like we can't do. There's like no out of the box way to do real time stuff with SST. That feels like I would fix that in any form than like try to getting the ergonomics right.
Yeah. This one's interesting because like I think usually that ends up being sort of true. Is that sometimes you run up against like design cases where it's like, oh, the design just looks like a little too scary. And to me, like the recent example, like I sort of look at like the hooks thing with React. It's like you have to put in so much work to explain that to people. At that point, you have to just start questioning, from a design perspective, was that a bad idea? Especially the use effects stuff. It's like, I don't know. So that one, I think this will depend on the specific cases, and I think this is why, like, when we do the event bus one, we'll probably have another conversation like that.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. The other way I kind of look at this and why I prefer sort of these individual launches is because it forces you to explain. I think Frank can maybe to wrap this up, Frank can maybe share like what he went through with the remix site stuff. But I think
I really want to
side effects was that.
Yeah, I really want to share the doc I wrote for guys. Like, it just make me think a lot more on like how are people going to use this. Like, would they understand what's the type of people that are coming? It's almost like a mini doc. So I end up adding like a quick start section for the in the construct doc to be like, okay, if you're coming in with just want to give remix a try, this is what you do to create a new remix app. If you have existing remix app, right, you come in, this is what you do. And then in your setting up, static site inv, this is how you create. Before I was running into this mental model, it's like, hey, I explained that somewhere else. It doesn't belong to this construct doc. But now I'm kind of treating this on its own, right? This is its own product where like Dax, you saw someone kind of reply to my tweet, be like, okay, I don't know what SST is. I want to give it a try. And Jay is like, oh, send him the link to the doc. And I look at the link of the doc. It doesn't the link to or this main doc page is like create SST. I'm like, at the end of that, he's going to have like a RDS backend plus like a V site. Oh my god, I can't imagine what's the next step for him. He's gonna run SST start, and then he's gonna wait for 15 minutes, realize it's not remix related. and I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna send him the link to the doc, right? It just
Our conclusion was let's ignore the tweet. Which is basically what we did. It's a terrible thing, but yeah, I think the point I was trying to get to is like these individual launches forces us to think about like marketing isn't quite the right word. It's like, how do you explain this stuff? And I think that is good. We'll probably have to do that for each and every one of these, right? Like the auth, the event bus, the config, testing, all of it. Kevin has some suggestions. I don't know if you read that, Dax. Also a question.
Yeah, so I think the stuff he's talking about is going to be solved with the config stuff we're working on. It's basically a custom construct that lets you pass through stuff like table names, queue names, in a type-safe way to your Lambda code. Is that what you're working on next, Frank?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be excited to have that because I think that should probably get launched before auth.
Yeah.
And auth will be the first thing that uses it.
That's true. All right. Yeah, I think we're good. Wow. It feels like somehow these things always end up being 2 hours. I don't understand how that's possible, but every single time it's like ballpark 2 hours.
Okay.
There was that one time we had a 4-hour meeting, I think.
I think we did.
We were very hungry at the end of that.
Yeah, I think it was both lunch and dinner. At least this time I was smart. I started eating right away. So I knew this was gonna happen. All right, yeah, let's.
Okay.
We'll probably do another demo at some point.
Okay, yeah, I'll probably demo the secret and the parameter stuff, and then yeah.
Oh, by the way, I'm working through the tutorial stuff, and I just realized it might double in size, but
I think that's good. It felt too short to me.
Yeah, no, I think
too
these
easy.
are going to be like internal stuff because there's like so much in there that I feel like that we had done, that we had talked about, but we didn't do a good job of explaining the tutorial. Like an example of this is like I'd totally forgotten that we were generating the types from the migrations. I had completely forgotten about that because that was like an iteration, right? At some point, we obviously didn't have that initially, and then at some point we did it. And I'm like, man, this is really cool, but not explained anywhere.
Yeah, completely invisible.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, no, that's good to hear, Kevin. All right, let's wrap it up then.
All right. See you, everyone.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks, guys.